is the curriculum we're going to follow, and this is when you're going to do it, and when the bell rings we're going to do this, and this is your homework, and this is what we need you to do. There is very limited choice and freedom, and there's also very limited opportunity for kids to really learn to be independent and to manage their own schedules and to manage their own time. And yet when you get into the adult world, and even before that, when you start to get particularly when you get to college, if that's the route you take, those skills are fundamental. And if you've been through your whole K-12 education, you've never had to do that, and suddenly you're faced with doing that, with choice and with managing a schedule, and with self-motivating. For some kids, they fall really flat. I think quite a few. It's a big shock.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope it wasn't too early.
No. So, I have young children, so this is not early.
Right. Yeah, so now without further ado, we'll just dive straight into the podcast. I'll just begin by giving an introduction of yourself and of the podcast as a whole, and then we'll dive straight into the questions.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Right. So today we're joined by our guest, Victoria Ransom. She is a graduate from Harvard Business School and a serial entrepreneur and founder of Access Strips, Wildfire Interactive, which was acquired by Google in 2012, and of the online learning platform Prisma, which will be our main topic of conversation today. So the intention of KatoCast, this podcast, is to spread awareness around education and the problems faced by its various stakeholders, and to eventually create a learning resource that these stakeholders can go back to in order to make education a more equitable space. Right. So Nikhil, why don't we dive straight into the questions?
Sure. Thanks. Yeah. So Victoria, we were very keen to jump into, the origin story behind Prisma, and how you guys thought about the problem statement. And as you said, like a lot of times the experience as a parent also determines the thought process. So very keen to know how, as a parent, you thought about the problems that are there, and how did you go about approaching the solution?
And we really did sort of come upon the education space because of our own needs and our own investigations relating to our family. I'm saying we, because my husband and I have been serial entrepreneurs together for years now. All those companies you mentioned, we started together, and it's the same with Prisma. And we have 3 children. They're all still young. The oldest will be 7 soon. We've got a 4.5-year-old and a 2.5-year-old. And we really started, as our oldest approached kindergarten age, we really started to think very deeply, and that led to investigating very deeply different educational options. And that was for 2 reasons. One is sort of a very personal reason, which is we live in the United States, but I'm from New Zealand and my husband's from Switzerland, and we really want our kids to be able to spend time in our respective home countries, but which we've been able to do because we created very flexible lives for ourselves. And then we realized, wait, when our oldest goes to school, we're not going to have that opportunity anymore. So that led us to think, are there more flexible ways to educate your kids? But the other is, we live in an area, Silicon Valley, where there's actually amazing schools, on paper at least, that are some of the best schools in the nation. But there is also a lot of pressure put on kids in schools in our area, particularly as you get towards the high school level. And there's quite an epidemic of anxiety and depression, again, as kids get older. And we didn't want to put our kids into a school system like that. I think at the elementary level, there's more options, but the older kids get, the more they get put into this sort of pressure cooker. Now, that's the situation that we're in. Other people are in situations where they don't have good schools in their neighborhood. It's a different problem. Anyway, this led to us sort of really diving deep into what are other options, alternative options to educating your kids. And we started by looking at more innovative schools in our area, and then we started looking at micro schools, and there's some really innovative micro schools around the world. And then eventually we started looking at homeschooling. And we didn't expect to sort of look into homeschooling, because I think we went in with, frankly, I think the kind of ideas that some people have, that a lot of people have, which is, wait, homeschooling, that's a little strange. Are kids well socialized?
Yeah.
But the more we dug into it, the more we really liked many things about homeschooling, in particular the fact that you can be very personalized in how you educate kids. You can really tailor the education around the speed that kids learn at, the level that they're at, the interests they have. And there's something really beautiful about that, I think, in terms of getting kids really excited about learning. So there was a lot to like about that. But for us, there were a couple of barriers to us wanting to homeschool our kids. One is that for a variety of reasons, we can't or don't think we would be best suited to being the full-time teacher for our kids. And the other is, although I believe homeschool kids are very well socialized and, you know, I think in many ways perhaps better socialized because they tend to interact with a wide range of ages, of kids and adults. It takes a lot of work, I think, to provide a really great peer group for homeschool kids. And there's something to be said about your kids going to school every day with a group of peers and being able to learn from each other that we really wanted to recreate for our own kids if we were going to homeschool them. You know, we figured out a way of how we would serve those needs for our own kids, which was to find a group of other homeschoolers, and they would come to our house every day, and, you know, like a homeschool co-op. But most families, I think that is not something that they can put together. And so we really got inspired by this idea of, can we create an approach to education that honors this idea of kids learning at their own pace, of kids learning at the level they're at, not just saying, well, you're 7, so you should be at a first grade level, and whether you're ready for that or not, that's what you're going to do. And that really honors this idea of allowing kids to pursue learning based on the kind of things they're interested in, and to dig deep where they want to dig deep. Can we find an educational model that honors that while also being open to parents who don't want to be their kids' full-time teacher, and while also providing a consistent peer group where kids can learn together, collaborate together, do projects together, discuss together, present together? And can we do it in a way where it could scale if it works? And can we do it in a way where it could be much more affordable than your typical private school experience? And that is Prisma. That's, you know, after lots of thinking and mulling, we eventually came across the Prisma model that, frankly, COVID came along, and we said, we got to try this now. We got to see if this works. And so the Prisma model, it's a full-time educational solution for 4th through 8th graders who learn from home. It is not like traditional homeschooling because there is a coach that works with kids. There is a robust project-based curriculum, and there is a peer group that meets several times daily and that collaborates and learns together and really gets to know each other very well. So it's not traditional homeschooling. It's also not traditional online schooling, which tends to look a lot like traditional schooling, but you just bring it online. So there's lectures and there's grades and there's textbooks. They might be virtual textbooks, but they still kind of look like textbooks.
Yeah.
It's very different from that. It's certainly not traditional public schooling. So we really think we've created our own category or approach to education, which we're calling connected learning. And we call it that because it is an approach to learning that is very connected to the world. So what's beautiful about the Prisma model is that kids from all over the United States and even from all over the world can learn and collaborate together. And there's something really, really special about that, because the kids are really, you know, as opposed to traditional education where you go to school with kids in a very narrow geographic area, all from the same zip code, which sometimes means there's not a lot of, often means there's not a lot of diversity in all levels, diversity of thought, diversity of socioeconomics, diversity of race. At Prisma, there's no boundaries, there's no barriers, like there's no constraints in terms of the diversity. So it's a very, we think it's a model that can be very connected. globally. That's very connected to technology. It is a model where fundamentally the curriculum and the coaching is happening in the cloud. But on top of that, we very much believe in leveraging the best educational technologies that exist in terms of adaptive learning. And so it's a very, it's sort of a technology first model, and it is also very connected to the individual needs and interests of kids. Everything about our model tries to provide choice, flexibility, and the chance for kids to really move at their pace. And so, yeah, that was a long way of explaining how we ended up in this education space, which is a fascinating and very meaningful place to be.
Awesome. So you spoke about a couple of things that I'm going to try to get to know a little bit more through the next question. So first, you spoke about how even though parents might want to do homeschooling or alternative education, they don't have the time or the resources or the capacity, whatever that may be. And another thing you spoke about was this idea of connected learning networks and how that's slightly different from traditional homeschooling. So one of the things that I particularly liked about Prisma is the openness and transparency you maintain around the program right from the very beginning. Like even as someone who's not enrolled in the program, I know the details of the curriculum, the learning framework, even the annual calendar and its market map. So it kind of gives you a picture of the extent you have to go to convince and build trust with the parents who are still who are ready to experiment, but they aren't really sure. So with that particular context, tell us a little bit more about the difference between homeschooling solutions, which is a relatively new area in and of itself, and the connected learning network, and why you sort of decided to go in this way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are all kinds of curriculum options for homeschoolers. Some of them are pen and paper based, and some of them are online. So there's really no shortage of curriculum resources that homeschool families can follow, and some of them have been around for a really long time. But before we embarked on the idea of homeschooling our own kids, and before we embarked on Prisma, we interviewed a whole bunch of homeschool families from all different walks of life, and we didn't hear from them that we're struggling to find curriculum. What we heard from them, the two main things, that the number one was we're struggling to put together this group of peers that my child can not just socialize with, but can learn with, and can really, something that's hard for some homeschool families is their kids are working on these amazing projects and they've got no one to show them to and no one to get feedback from except the parent. So I think that was one need that we really heard. And another, not from all families, but certainly from quite a few of the families, was it's a lot of work, and as a parent, they're feeling very stretched, particularly as kids get older and they start to sort of both need some separation from parents and also the academic rigor of what they're needing. In some cases, starts to really stretch the parent. That the parent needing sort of more support and more space was something we heard, and so that is something that traditional homeschool service providers have not solved those two needs very well, or not at all. And so that's really something that we focused on, is providing the whole package, a curriculum, but a curriculum that's still flexible enough that homeschool families that really want to still have a lot of say in their kids' education, that there's room for that. The peer group that really meets every day, and not just meeting via Zoom, although that's a really important piece of it, but also collaborating on projects, chatting together, clubs. We've got some really vibrant clubs that students have put together at Prisma, and this coaching piece. So there is a coach there to support the child, understand the child, make sure that the child is progressing, and that the child's needs are getting met. That I think is very different from other companies that are out there to support homeschoolers. And because it is a really a complete package, it's actually opening up this world of home-based learning to families that would have never ever considered it before. And in fact, a lot of the families at Prisma, they're not families that have homeschooled for years, although we do have families at Prisma that have homeschooled for years, but they're actually families that have had their kids in public school or private school and are looking for something different. And this opportunity is opened up to them to educate their kids in a home-based way because Prisma puts together sort of the complete package.
I think that's like really great way to dive into the sort of next theme that we wanted to pick up. You mentioned that a couple of things that are unique. One is for homeschoolers especially. One is that it's a lot of work, and mostly parents may or may not be able to provide the right kind of support and cater to all the needs, individual needs of the learner, especially as they grow. You said they generally typically would want to be more independent, and they have their own interests, aspirations. So I wanted to just delve a little bit deeper into these two aspects. One is, for example, how do you really tap into the intrinsic motivation of these learners? In the sense that I could see that, you can, it doesn't start with a very structured curriculum in the sense that you start with this subject. It starts with, little more exploring. You have certain themes around which you can try out different projects and then pick out one area that you want to probably focus on. But how does this work for the learner throughout the process in terms of where do parents come in? What kind of inputs do coach give in this? How do they support the child, the kid, when he or she is trying to learn what they really want to learn and focus on something?
Yeah, great question. So we very much believe in the importance of giving kids choice and independence. And, I think one thing that the traditional public system, and it's by necessity, it's very much sort of, it's a conveyor belt. And, kids get on that and they come in at a certain grade level, and this is the curriculum we're going to follow, and this is when you're going to do it, and when the bell rings, we're going to do this, and this is your homework, and this is what we need you to do. There is very limited choice and freedom, and there's also very limited opportunity for kids to really learn to be independent and to manage their own schedules and to manage their own time. And yet when you get into the adult world, and even before that, when you start to get particularly when you get to college, if that's the route you take, those skills are fundamental. And if you've been through your whole K-12 education, you've never had to do that, and suddenly you're faced with doing that, with choice and with managing a schedule and with self-motivating. For some kids, they fall really flat. I think quite a few. It's a big shock. So we believe in that should be experienced and taught from a very young age. So it's natural, and kids are really great at it. Having said that, we also believe in giving scaffolding, that you can't just sort of throw a kid out there and say, off you go, educate yourself. I mean, there are philosophies that do that, and self-directed learning can be very much fall into that extreme. We, I think, believe in self-directed learning, but also believe in giving some guardrails. And so the way we do that is we always want there to be choice, and we want there to be freedom in terms of how kids organize their days. But we also provide support. So, for example, you just mentioned that Prisma operates with themes. So we operate in 6-week cycles, and every cycle has a theme. It's a very broad theme, so there's still a lot of flexibility in terms of the direction you go within that theme. So, for example, we've had themes like cities of the future, or cyber citizens, or right now Prisma Kids are doing Inventor Studio, where they're learning about design thinking. It's a very and STEM topics, and they're having to come up with their own inventions. But within those themes, and every cycle, kids are working on a project, a really robust project that they work on, and at the end they present it at Expo Day to not only their peers, but to all the parents in the community, and sometimes grandparents and aunts and uncles show up. Expo Day is always a really big deal and really fun. But there's always a choice around the kind of project that kids that kids do. So for example, with Cities of the Future, kids could choose from a range of different projects that they might pursue, anything from build your own city on Mars, and that entailed not only sort of exploring space and understanding space, but it also required kids to think about cities and how they run. Like what kind of jobs is your city going to have? What kind of governance system will it have? What kind of, how will you plan your city? So that was one option. Another option for kids within that cycle was to design their own environmentally friendly building, and so they had to think about all different green building techniques and what it means to be who's going to use their building, and will it be in a city, will it be in a town, and then they had to write a proposal for a city council arguing why theirs was the best building, and they had to physically create their building. Some did it in Minecraft, some did it with physical materials. There was an option in that cycle for kids to think about art in cities. Why is art important? What kind of messages does art deliver? And then they had to come up with their own public art piece and write an artist statement. So, within that broad theme, there were all kinds of directions that kids could go in. And within those projects, we scaffolded it for them. It wasn't just, okay, design your own building. It was, okay, let's learn about different building techniques and why are environmentally friendly buildings important. And okay, now figure out which of those environmentally friendly building materials you're going to incorporate and who's the user of your building, et cetera, et cetera. So that's sort of, there's choice, but there's support. Similarly, with kids' schedules, they get to design their own schedules. Prisma, from in terms of sort of we have a daily stand-up that starts at 10 a.m. for kids, where they all get together with their coach, and it's a lot of community building and sharing with one another, presenting to one another. There's discussing current events. So that is something that all the kids are doing. But what they do before that, each kid gets to design that themselves. Maybe they start at 8 a.m. because they're an early riser. Maybe they don't start till 10 a.m. But again, we don't just say, okay, figure out your own schedule. There's a coach that sits down with the kids and says, what schedule is going to work best with you? And if it doesn't seem to be working, then they'll tweak that. Same with daily goals. Kids are responsible for their daily goals, but there's also the coach there that's helping them to figure out the best way for them to manage their goals and helping them, meeting with them regularly to make sure they're meeting their goals. So it's this mix of freedom, self-management, but also with guardrails and with support, both designed with the curriculum itself, but also with that coach there to support kids.
Awesome. I think that this is distinctly different from the way a lot of education systems work, because I come from a country where there is an immense focus on written tests, on standardization. How do you measure everybody at the same level? And with this whole idea of personalization, it's not possible, or more than that, it's not been done at such a vast level before. And in most learning systems, the way we ensure that a kid is actually learning and growing beyond just the project system is through assessment, a marks-based objective test based on content. But Prisma doesn't give grades. And employs a more holistic approach, which is something we've been trying to understand on this podcast before as well. How do we make assessments more, more friendly, more child friendly? How do we remove the stress? How do we make it actually an actual assessment rather than a rote memorization exercise where you have to regurgitate information? How was the holistic assessment at Prisma created? What benefits does it have in the longer run? And have you observed any positive impact already? And were there any real technical challenges in establishing an authentic way to measure and communicate the learner's progress?
There's so much to unpack there. So you might have to prompt me if I'm missing some of the key parts of your question. I guess the first thing this is more diving into a specific piece of your question, and then I can zoom out. But as it relates to grades, let me just begin with that. we don't give grades to Prisma kids. And that is because there's actually quite a lot of research out there that shows that grades are detrimental in a number of ways. I mean, I think it's not hard for people to imagine how grades are detrimental to kids that don't get good grades. For kids that don't get good grades, they very quickly start to learn, I'm not good at school. And once you learn I'm not good at school, then you lose motivation, and then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But even for kids that get good grades, they can be really detrimental because, first of all, it teaches kids to learn for the sake of grades, which is not the reason to learn. You learn because it's fulfilling and it's interesting and it's exciting. And also you sort of learn to do just enough to get a good grade. And what we want kids is to do their very best. Not, if you think about how the typical school system works, you're given an assignment or an essay, you work on it, you hand it in, you get a grade, you may get some written feedback, but you may not even get any written feedback, and then you just move on. So if you got a bad grade, you have no chance to really understand why it was bad and to go back and improve it and revise it. And if you get a good grade, you also have no chance to go back and make it better, and you can always make it better. So our philosophy is that we give feedback, our coaches give written feedback, verbal feedback, all the way along as a kid is working on a project or a piece of writing. They're constantly getting feedback and revising it so that theoretically by the time they're finished, it is their best work, rather than you hand it in and you move on and it's not your best work. And we have found that to be incredibly effective. I think the constant feedback is really the constant feedback and the depth of relationship that kids have with their coach is really causing kids to work hard and to really learn, because learning is exciting, and to really work to try to do their best. So that's sort of, one piece of your question. The bigger piece around assessment and how do we assess and how do we come up with that? We do believe in assessment. We're not, I think there's some people don't believe in measuring and trying to track that you're meeting goals. We want to hold ourselves accountable for meeting the goals that we set for ourselves. And so we have looked at ways to assess kids, but we do it in a very holistic way, because I think where assessment falls flat in many schools is it drives everything and it becomes stressful and it's narrow. It's like, did kids learn these specific pieces of knowledge in a specific area? And so then naturally the entire curriculum and time spent in classes starts to drive around just making sure that kids have those specific pieces of knowledge so they become good at the test. In our case, we are assessing kids, but it is goes far beyond just what are they, are they progressing in math, or are they progressing in ELA? It's, are they growing in their social emotional skills in the way that we want? Are they growing, we call it 21st century skills? Are they developing their 21st century skills, their independence, their critical thinking, their teamwork and collaboration? Are they growing in the way that we want? And basically, how do we develop this? Well, we started by thinking, what is the purpose of school? And I think, I don't know how many schools step back and say, what is the purpose? What are we doing here? And unfortunately, I think in many schools, it's become, well, the purpose is to get good test scores. No, for us, the purpose is to prepare kids to thrive in their adult lives. And we think that the lives that kids today are going to face are vastly different from the kind of lives that their parents might have faced for a variety of reasons. One of them is just AI, I think, is going to turn the job market upside down. And, I read a research report recently that said that 65% of kids currently in elementary school will work in jobs that we don't even exist right now. So how do you prepare kids for a world where you don't even know what jobs will exist, and a world where most likely kids are going to have to change careers and reinvent themselves multiple times. So we started with sort of, our goal is to prepare kids for the lives they will lead in this 21st century, which will be vastly different from the 20th century. From there, we created a framework of, well, to thrive in that kind of world, here are the things that we think kids will need to be really great at. And we came up with this framework called our prismatic framework, because it's actually maps onto a prism. You can find that on our website. It's quite in depth and I won't go through it all. But basically, it's a very holistic view of what we think kids need to get out of a Prisma education. And it starts with sort of foundational academics. That's the base of the prism, because yes, it's very important that kids develop a good sense and good skills in terms of numeracy and literacy and understanding scientific method, etc. And so that is the base of our learning framework. But the sides are equally important, and the sides are, one of the sides of the prism is powers. And what we mean by powers is we think it's incredibly important for kids to develop creativity, critical thinking, and communication skills. It's a huge part of what we do at Prisma. Another side of the prism of our learning framework is perspectives. We think it's really important for kids to develop a global perspective and to really understand the perspectives of many different people. We think it's very important for kids to understand where the future is taking us. And I don't think schools spend a lot of time thinking about, how a city's going to evolve, how is AI going to affect our world? But not just that, what does the past teach us about what might happen in the future? So perspectives is a really important piece of what we do. Practices, there are certain practices that we want kids to do every day and get really good at, like self-reflection, like design thinking, like collaboration, that we really build into everything we do at Prisma. And then the other piece is personal mindset. We really think there's certain personal mindsets that are critical for kids to develop, for them to not only succeed in their own education, but in adulthood, like having a growth mindset, like being really strong in terms of self-efficacy, like really developing strong social emotional skills. So that we developed our framework, and from there we looked at ways to assess, are we achieving that? And so we Prisma kids 3 times a year, they take a nationally recognized assessment in terms of their growth in mathematics, in terms of their growth in reading comprehension. And actually the kids just took that test recently, and we're really excited to see that they're growing in both areas. They're growing at 150% the rate of what would be expected, sort of the national average. So we're thrilled that in terms of those foundational academics, the kids are really growing. We use a social emotional assessment to make sure that kids, it's an external social emotional assessment to make sure that kids are growing in terms of their social emotional skills. And then in terms of some of these other sort of 21st century skills, we've designed our own assessment, because there's nothing out there that we could find that we felt was really robust. And so we really look at the beginning of the year, in the middle of the year, and at the end. We look at, and we do it by looking at specific projects that the kids are working on. And we look at their growth in terms of creative thinking, their growth in terms of being able to be independent, their growth in their sort of quality of their communication skills. And so, we are really trying to holistically assess, so that there's no one piece of assessment that sort of starts to drive the whole model. And in terms of the kids, in many cases, they don't even know that this assessment is happening. And when they do, we very much say, we make it as low stakes and as low pressure as possible. We say, we want you to really do your best here, because we're using this in order to tailor your education. Tailor it to your needs as much as we possibly can. It is not here to stress you out. And we're finding that it is not something that kids are really stressing about. And in fact, the academic assessment that we use, it's not, kids have as long as they like to complete that. So it's not a kind of time pressure, oh my gosh, I'm rushing, I can't think, kind of an assessment. So it was a very long answer because it was a very big question. But that's how we do it.
So I think we needed that sort of understanding because assessment often tends to be multi-layered, and it's great that we are actually moving towards something that's sustainable in that aspect. So I'm just going to go on a little bit of tangent over here. To come back to the age group that Prisma caters to, which is late elementary school and the entirety of middle school, almost 9 to 14 years.
Yeah.
And oftentimes people who put their kids in experimental schools or experimental models of learning, it's often really either early ages, like start as soon as possible so the kid grows to think that way, or at the high school level to prepare them for college, or so that the kids don't make the same mistakes as the parents did. So this 9 to 14-year age group, it's a segment that hasn't really been targeted a lot. We often tend to gloss over this. So why this age group? Was there any particular intention?
There very much was, and I think there's two reasons. One is, and frankly, this is not something that I knew as I started to delve into the education space, but the more we spoke to educators, the more we heard this over and over again, that there's sort of fourth grade can be a real turning point, and those middle school years can be a real turning point for kids in terms of their love of learning and their confidence. That, you know, for around fourth grade in the US at least, you start to see more standardized testing, which I think is perhaps part of the reason. I also think it's just as kids move into those adolescent years, they're going through a lot. And so a lot of teachers said they really start to, around fourth, fifth, sixth grade, they start to see kids losing their confidence around learning, and they really start to see them, you start to hear more and more the three words, I hate school. That kindergarten, a lot of kids are really excited to be at school, and first grade, hopefully that continues, but around that fourth grade, fifth grade, sixth grade mark, you just start to see it shift. And so we were really excited about, can we catch kids at that stage? And instead of them starting to lose confidence in their own abilities, and instead of them starting to lose motivation, and instead of them starting to not enjoy school as much, can we do the opposite? Make sure they love school more than ever, and that their confidence grows. So it's one thing. The other is we actually think at the high school level, parents start to get more risk averse because you get closer to college applications, and that's the point where I think many parents, even if they see that the model of education that their child is in is not working, they are very nervous about trying anything different in case it somehow ruins their kid's chance of getting into college. I mean, I personally think your child has more potential of standing out if they've done something different from other kids than if they've done sort of the same model where they basically look the same as every other kid that's applying. You know, they went to a great school, got great grades, did AP courses, has all these extracurriculars. Well, that's great, but almost every other kid that's applying looks like that. So anyway, that's a side note. I think for a lot of parents, they're very afraid of trying something different at that high school level because of the college application process. And so we felt that middle school is still a time where parents might be willing to experiment and try something different. To your point, there's a lot more choice in terms of innovative models at the elementary level than there is at the middle school level. And so, yeah, that's the decision that we made, and it's been just a wonderful age group to work around, because the kids are so curious, and they're really starting to think more deeply, and they're starting to become more independent. And so we found that it's been a really wonderful age group to sort of build the Prisma model around.
Yeah, I think I personally completely agree, and that's pretty much how even I've been thinking, because as you said, like in the early years, parents typically get to naturally be more involved with their kids, and then when they are closer to making some sort of a high stake decision in terms of what they want to do, that is the time then again that sort of in some way panic sets in, but that middle time is where uh, sometimes gets ignored. And hence, if you're able to really move the needle in that, I think something like this becoming a lot more mainstream is like pretty possible. So that's like great way to crack this entire thing. So that sort of brings us to, you know, how we look at things panning out going ahead, like a mid to long term view. As you said, like what we carry from our history is that now there is a lot more discussion and, you know, some sort of a common awareness that's building that the kind of traditional education system that we have built, well, it worked for a certain time. Going forward, as you were saying, that the economies are changing, and hence the way we would operate, organize ourselves is completely, you know, moving, and hence there is a clear need to, you know, rebuild the education system in itself. And we see that sort of conversations happening in not just sort of more developed markets or countries like US and some others, but even in this side of the world as well. Like, for example, India especially had just 2020 announced its new education policy. And very interestingly, just on this, that it very specifically talks about how, based on the age group, you need to take a very different approach towards the pedagogy that you follow. You know, in early years, it should be different. From grade 4 to 8, it should be different, and higher grades, it should be different. It also, you know, very clearly maps out that we need a lot more ways to experiment at the intersection of things, whether it's content, pedagogy, or even new technologies that are coming up. So a lot of exciting things being talked about here, and also maybe top down from governments and higher ups. But sort of for me, always I think, so what about, you know, lot more bottom up way, like the currently existing system, will it really adapt to these sort of changes, or is that going to just fall off? When you're talking to teachers or systems, all of them have right intentions, but seem to be in some way trapped. So I just wanted to know how you think about these kind of models. What are the dynamics behind these things becoming more mainstream? Is it just the mindsets? Is it affordability? Is it technology? What are the variables that you think would really move the needle in the mid to long term?
Right. And that's definitely another big question. I mean, I think to start with, I do think the public system it tries to evolve and tries to adapt, I think. And you know, you see with some public schools are experimenting with project-based learning, and others are, I certainly know in this area, are experimenting with reducing or eliminating homework at certain ages. So innovation happens. I do think it happens slowly. And it is very hard for big innovation to happen in the public education system because it is such a large, entrenched system. It's a bit like looking in the corporate world, to take a huge corporate entity and then you take little nimble startups. The nimble startup is going to eat the lunch usually of the big corporate entity in terms of innovation, trying new things, moving quickly, because it's just hard to move large, entrenched organizations. So yes, I think the public system, our existing system, will evolve and adapt, and it always tries to. But I think probably the true innovation and the more nimble innovation is going to come from smaller entrepreneurial players. In terms of, you know, when are these shifts going to happen, and when might we see an acceleration of that? I actually think what's happened over the last year with COVID and COVID forcing online learning onto many kids and families, I think that will create a step change in terms of innovation and families adopting more innovative models. And I think that's for two reasons. One, it forced a lot of families to try more innovative models. They sort of felt like, oh my goodness, this year is going to be a disaster. We'll try anything. And I certainly think there were some families that came into Prisma with that mindset, and they're sticking with us because it really worked. But they were not families who 2 years ago, if you had said to them, do you want to try this alternative? They would have said, no, thank you. So there's that. And I also think COVID opened parents' eyes and gave them insight into their kids' education in a way they never had before, because they were right there listening. And not all families, but a lot of parents were right there listening to what was happening in their kids' classroom, and they were having to be hands-on involved in the kind of work their kids were doing. And I think for some parents that sort of opened their eyes to being a little underwhelmed by what they were seeing, and also seeing like, this is not working for my kid. And it's interesting because if you look at surveys prior to COVID, many teachers are dissatisfied with this sort of traditional system. Many kids are, but parents were kind of like, it's okay. There was not this like pitchforks, this is not working for us. But I actually think, and I think maybe that's because they didn't have a lot of insight into what was going on. And, you know, for a lot of parents, they say to their kid, how did your day go? And the kid's like, fine. And that's about all they get. And so I do think this insight that parents have got, and this sort of being forced into trying different things that happened during COVID, I do think that's going to have a step change effect in terms of adoption of different models like homeschooling and like microschooling and like hybrid learning. And so I think that's one thing that might really create a bit of momentum in terms of parents and school districts trying new things. I mean, I actually read an article recently that said 1 in 5 school districts in the US are going to provide a online learning option, you know, beyond COVID, that's a big change in the system. So yeah, I'm hopeful that we will actually see an acceleration in innovation in the education space.
So does Prisma in particular have any plans to sort of accelerate or give a thrust to this momentum, especially in emerging markets? Obviously, the US has always been one step ahead when it comes to experimental education than say developing countries like India. And so do you have any plans to break into markets, and what barriers do you see for more mainstream adoption in lesser developed geographies?
Yes, we do have plans. I mean, you heard me say it before, a big part of our vision is that this could be a global model, and that kids from different countries could be interacting and learning together. Because I actually went to, it's what brought me to the US in the first place. I went to an international school called the United World College, and it was the most intense and accelerated and meaningful learning experience of my life. And a large part of that is because I was learning from and hearing from kids that grew up in totally different circumstances and that had very different mindsets. So we dream of Prisma kids having access to that kind of sort of melting pot of learning. But we are also very, very focused on quality and having a really quality learning experience. And that means we do not intend to grow any faster than we can whilst maintaining our quality and whilst maintaining a great learning experience. So yes, as a vision, we absolutely want to grow, and we absolutely want to open up to more markets. And in fact, we have kids, international kids that are already a part of Prisma. It is open to anyone from any country. The constraint right now is time zones. You have to be able to operate with US time zones. So it is already somewhat global, but we are not going to try to rapidly scale out Prisma until we are confident we can do that in a way that will honor the kind of great learning experience that we're currently offering. So yes, I think the answer is yes, but we will do it in a way that's smart and sensible and that can really work.
Just curious to know, since as you said, the vision is to look at it as a connected network and a globally connected network. So what kind of interesting geographies, locations that you have come across so far across the globe? Where do you see these activity, or what kind of parents, apart from your core US markets, do you see picking up?
I mean, when we went back and a while ago, I mentioned that we interviewed a bunch of homeschool families when we were first exploring this space. And we actually spoke to some homeschooling families in Nigeria, of all places. And it was fascinating because homeschooling is actually, it's actually unclear if it's even allowed. And there are some cases of homeschool families being prosecuted, and yet there's a small but robust set of homeschool families there, because they're so desperate to get out of the very rigid, it was a very sort of traditional, at least the way they explained it, and I am not an expert on the education system in Nigeria, but the way they explained it is it's very sort of traditional, rigid, rote learning, very little room for sort of bringing individuality into learning or bringing joy into learning. And here were families that were overcoming enormous barriers to try to create something different for their kids. And so to your point, I think there's already a lot of opportunity and a lot of challenges in the US education system. But when you start to look to countries that are perhaps several years behind in terms of bringing more innovative approaches into their education system, I think that's really exciting. And you could have perhaps even bigger impact. And so I think the answer, the honest answer is we see a lot of opportunity across many different countries for a Prisma-like model. I also spoke to a family actually a couple of families in Turkey recently that they had a similar sort of complaint, like the system is so rigid and we're seeing the joy sucked out of our kids. And that they were interested in trying to layer Prisma onto their kids' day-to-day education, because they weren't sure that they could make it their kids from a legal standpoint, their kids' only education. So we see enormous opportunity, but coming back to what I said before, I think one step at a time. Like, we first want to really refine and nail Prisma in the market that we're in, and then we'll think about opening up to broader markets. Although, like I said, anyone can join Prisma right now if they can work within the constraints of the time zone. And the reason why it's constrained is a big and really important part of Prisma is these live workshops. They're super engaging, they're super collaborative, and they are currently optimized for US time zones.
Yeah, so we don't really have a lot of time. And we have a bunch of more questions, and this has been a really engaging discussion. So I'd just like to close with like one question that we ask almost everybody who comes onto this podcast, which is, what is a problem in education that you would like to see being solved? What is something that nobody has thought, or even if there is traction, there isn't much, and we need to start focusing on it?
There's so many problems I'd love to see being solved. That this will not be news to anyone, but I think a huge problem that it would be great to see more people working to solve is just the inequality of opportunity that exists in education. I mean, speaking in the US, but I think this is a global issue. Depending on what zip code you live in has an enormous impact on the quality of education you get. And that is partly because funding of schools comes from property taxes. And so, at a basic level, how can we just make sure that there's more equality of opportunity for kids within countries and around the globe? That is something that I think we need as many people as possible thinking about that. Another thing, and I think this very much ties into Prisma's philosophy, is just this conveyor belt approach to education, where kids of the same age group are put into grade levels and they're expected to all move at the same pace. And that absolutely doesn't happen that way. And so you end up with a system of sort of one size fits very few, where the kids that are not able to move at the same pace that the teacher is moving at, and the teacher is moving at that pace because the teacher has a curriculum he or she needs to get through. And they can't slow down. And so then you have some kids that they don't quite grasp a concept. Too bad, we've got to move on. And things build upon each other. And so if you didn't grasp that concept, you may very well not grasp the next concept. And if you didn't grasp fourth grade, you're certainly not going to grasp fifth grade. So you fall more and more behind, and you get more and more disillusioned, and you more and more think that you're just not good. That's for the kids that fall behind. And there's a whole bunch of kids that could be moving faster. So what happens to them? They're bored. And school just becomes boring, and they're sitting there biding their time, and you have this small sweet spot of kids that it's actually working for. And I understand why it works like a conveyor belt, but it's just not working. And models that can start to rethink that. And I think technology and adaptive learning technologies is one piece of the solution here. I think that is a huge problem that needs to be solved. The other one that we have talked about quite a lot is just this extreme focus on testing and this focus on making sure we sort of stuff kids' heads full with these certain pieces of knowledge, and then we make sure they can regurgitate it. I really believe that school should be about learning how to learn, not memorizing certain pieces of content. And so I think the more that we can innovate around that, of holistically looking at education instead of looking at it as pieces of knowledge that we give to kids and then we test whether they got it, I think is enormously important, particularly if we want to prepare kids for this, this future that is going to be full of opportunity, but full of challenge as well. And I think we're going to need kids that are very nimble and creative and adaptive, and that really, that have really honed the things that make humans very unique and different, like our ability to collaborate and work together, our social emotional skills, our creativity. That's what we should be focused on in schools. So those are three big problems that are not easily solved, but they need to be solved.
Awesome. Yeah. So we have a lot to think about and a lot of the ideas to go back to the drawing board with. And yeah, it has been a wonderful, wonderful conversation. And thank you so much for joining us. We can't wait to see where Prisma goes and how we can engage with it further. Thank you.
Thank you. It was nice to meet you both, and good luck.